The Dragons of Pemberley. Book 10 of Jane Austen's Dragons by Maria Grace. Narrated by Benjamin Fife. Chapter 1. June 9th, 1815. Derbyshire, England. Pemberley. Elizabeth swallowed back tears as the luxurious travelling coach, expertly driven by Alistair Salt, crossed over that little, almost imperceptible bump in the road that meant home was around the next bend. Soon the steady clop of horses' hoofs and the scratchy footfalls of the guard drakes Kingsley and Sargent running beside the carriage would stop. No more road dust leaving her eyes gritty and her nose itching. No more watching the world go by as she sat and sat and sat. They would be home. She leaned back with the rock and sway of the carriage springs, melting into soft squabs. One could hardly object to travelling in a conveyance endowed with every possible comfort, from sleeping platforms to a tiny desk that dropped down from one wall. The Blue Order spared no expense in assuring their comfort and protection on the journey back home. The size of their party proved the only disadvantage. 3 ladies, 3 gentlemen, an infant, and 7 minor dragons, and meant the men travelled in a lesser coach, separate from the ladies. It might be proper, but travelling at Darcy's side would have been far more agreeable. Soon that distance from him would no longer be nagging at the back of her mind. Soon this netherworld existence between here and there would be over, and life would begin again. She drew a deep breath. There it was, a hint of peonies in the air. The bushes near the road that approached the house often bloomed earliest, in riots of pink and white, an exuberant greeting to Pemberley visitors. Her nose wrinkled a bit. Anne's napkin needed to be changed soon. She opened one eye and glanced at May, the little black tatzelworm curled up beside Anne in her sleeping basket. The way her decidedly cat-like nose twitched, the little dragon agreed. Anne had grown so much since they had left Pemberley. It seemed like a lifetime ago. What would life be like now that she was in leading strings, able to move about and discover for herself? Mrs. Sharp, the new nurse, would no doubt have her hands full, especially with all the household dragons that would be spending time in the nursery with Anne. Elizabeth had warned her that managing those dragons' interactions would be part of the nurse's duties, but it would not be surprising if Mrs. Sharp underestimated the sheer number of household dragons that would be involved. Babies did not usually receive so much company. The manor house appeared as they rounded the final bend in the road, majestic, commanding, but most of all welcoming. The first time Elizabeth had seen the manor, it had intimidated her for so many reasons. She did not belong in such a fine place. She did not deserve such a home. She had no idea how to oversee such an establishment. So many tenants and servants depending on her to manage properly. An entire community looking to her for guidance and direction. Things Mamma had never prepared her for. But, surrounded by people and dragons who wanted her to succeed, Elizabeth had found her place in the stately manor, serene and strong, as it looked out over fields and sheep. Oh, how she needed to be there once again. They had definitely been gone too long. "That is Pemberley?" Lydia squealed, face pressed against the side glass, eyes wide in little girl wonder. "No, my dear sister, that is the servants' quarters, and the actual house is another mile ahead." Elizabeth quirked her eyebrow. "You have become such a tease. Returning to Derbyshire is good for you," Lydia chuckled.
"Indeed it is,"
Tiny fairy dragon April, in her turquoise-blue glory, hovered near the window, with black and red Cosette beside her flight unhampered by her previous injuries.
"You will like it here. It is a proper dragon estate, with proper respect for the minor dragons who live here."
Truth and mercy, Mrs. Sharp's pair of little green Zalties slithered over Lydia's lap to the window to get a view as well, forked tongues flicking with excitement. Mrs. Sharp tucked little Anne's blanket around her shoulders. "I wish the same could have been said for our last family. My little friends were not welcome there. I wonder if it was a general discomfort with dragons around children, or it was something about snake types in particular." Elizabeth studied the pretty little Zalties, with their noses pressed to the side glass, sleek and emerald green. Dainty captured them better than anything else. Big, dark eyes, framed by long eyelashes, spoke of their gentle dispositions and caring nature, while their yellow and red head crests resembled women's hats, giving them just a touch of whimsy. What was not endearing about the pair? It seems that even people who are generally well disposed to dragons often have some discomfort when it comes to snake-type dragons, especially small ones. The late afternoon sun bathed Mrs. Sharp's deep amber skin and shimmered off the soft grey curls peeking out from her cap. "It is not uncommon that people base their judgment on how one appears, Lady Sage. More than once, my friends have been unwelcome in otherwise dragon-friendly company. Well, that shall not be a problem here. You should know Mrs. Reynolds has mentioned that the dearth of snake types at the manor was a true disadvantage." "How extraordinary!" Mrs. Sharp's eyebrows lifted so high they almost touched the silver curls on her forehead. "You will find Mrs. Reynolds a remarkable woman for many reasons. I expect you will get on famously." Mrs. Sharp's eyebrows rose even higher. Yes, it was a touch unusual to lavish such praise on one's servants, but letting someone know they were appreciated was hardly ever a mistake. "How many minor dragons are there at Pemberley?" Lydia alternately stroked Truth and Mercy as Cosette came to rest on her shoulder. "On the estate as a whole, I really cannot say at the moment. We will have to conduct a census of the wild dragons come summer. All the staff, inside and out, our dragon heroes and their friends are welcome. Most of the staff dragons have friends among the warm-blooded staff, but a few are with us simply of their own accord. We have no dragon deaf living at the manor house." A shudder slithered down Elizabeth's spine. How complicated life would be to have dragon deaf in the household. "Does that mean you will not invite Mamma, Jane, or Kitty to stay with us?" Lydia asked, with no trace of the petulance that once would have dripped from those words. "That is a good question, one to which I do not have a good answer. With us back in the neighbourhood, and the Bingleys not living far enough away to discourage travel between the households, it may be difficult to avoid."
"Cosette and I can easily persuade your mother that Pemberley is cold and draughty, and she does not like such places,"
April suggested, landing on Elizabeth's knee, her head cocked just so. "I do not think I will ask that of you just yet, but you can be sure it will be kept under consideration." Elizabeth scratched under April's chin. "We will have to see them soon in any case. Mamma's last letter to Papa suggested that they need his approval of Kitty's beau soon." Lydia sighed, wistfulness in her eyes. "Kitty is quite smitten with him." "Has she been writing to you?" Elizabeth asked. "I thought she was quite put out at the idea that you were permitted to attend finishing school and enjoy a ball for your come-out while she was not." "She was at first. But once she discovered the joy of being Mamma's only daughter at home, she quite forgave me." Lydia shrugged. "In any case, it seems she is anxious for approval, so that the banns might be read. Mamma delights in the notion of 4 daughters married. You do understand that my sisters are dragon-deaf, and my own affiliation with the Order now makes things complex. Yes, Lizzie, even I am aware of the complications of the circumstance. I did not mean to imply. I do not think you are stupid. That is not what I meant. What a challenge, adjusting to this new Lydia. At Mrs. Fielding's school, there was a lot of talk about difficulty of half-blue families. Quite a number of the girls there came from such situations. Perhaps she needed to take time to ask Lydia more about that. It was not something that Papa had ever talked about, but perhaps he should have. Were such families more apt to problems? It would stand to reason that they would be. Perhaps that was another topic she should write about. She needed to add that to her list. Oh, look! Is that the staff lining up to greet us? I had no idea our arrival would be so grand. Chapter 2. Pemberley Manor, the core of hearth and home, the seat of the Darcy family, so dear it was almost a member of the family, revealed itself as they completed the last turn on the way home. Sturdy, pale stone walls, strong and unchanging, surveyed its domain and declared it secure. Something tight released in Darcy's chest, and he leaned back into the carriage's stiff squabs. Perhaps, just perhaps, life as he knew it might begin again. One never grows tired of that sight. Richard Fitzwilliam chin-pointed out the smudgy side glass toward the manor. Sharp and rectangular like his father, Lord Chancellor Matlock, the lines beside his eyes spoke to the weariness the last few months had laid upon him. Although that look of satisfaction you wear, Darcy, might become exhausting. After all they had been through whilst in London, so many impossible things had happened. Somehow it was a relief to see the manor's classic lines and square countenance still standing, overlooking well-groomed fields and flocks. Better still to be standing on the doorsteps, not viewing it from a mile away, through the windows of a tired, dusty, sweat-stinking coach. Soon, very soon. A man has a right to be satisfied at coming home. Darcy glanced across the coach at the Honourable Under-Secretary of the Blue Order, Mr. Swinton St. John, who snored softly, slumped against the sidewall, as he had been for much of their time on the road. The man's hairline was receding, his belly paunchy, and his eyes close-set and squinty. Every time he spoke, his face screwed up like he had a bad smell under his nose, which entirely fit both his conversation and his personality. Though being apart from Elizabeth was a form of torture unique unto itself, it was just as well that she had not been stuck in a carriage with the man. The years notwithstanding, she still bore him more than a passing resentment. Darcy was developing one of his own to match. St. John had been the one to conduct her testing for admission into the order a dozen years or so ago. According to her and April, he had been insensitive, rude, and harsh throughout the whole matter, though Darcy had thought their assessment might have been coloured by the suffering experienced at his hand. After spending days with him on the road, he suspected they were actually gracious in their evaluation of him. According to Casterdale, Sir Edward Dressler's pa-snake, and one of Elizabeth's early champions among the order officers, St. John disliked her father, resented that he held office as historian, distrusted women, and did not believe that children should be able to hear dragons. So intent was he on proving his point, he engineered the entire experience to set Elizabeth up to fail. Like many, he had been wrong, and not pleased to have been proven so, especially under circumstances so stacked against her. Circumstances he had conveniently arranged to deftly avoid criticism toward himself. What he lacked in character, he seemed to make up for in cleverness. Not the kind of man with whom Darcy wanted to have any dealings. Neither his boorish manners nor his ignorant opinions on far too many matters seemed to have altered from Elizabeth's early descriptions of him. St. John still thought women had no place in the order, considered Bennet an irritating old curmudgeon, on which point he might not be entirely in error, and disliked the entire notion of establishing any new order office, especially that of the Dragon Sage. Why should the order change when it had withstood the ravages of time better than any other governmental agency? But he was sympathetic toward minor dragons, his one lone virtue. After their first day of travel, Richard had privately suggested St. John was still grieving the loss of his friend, minor Drake Rottenstone, and his abrasive personality could be the consequence of his grief. The dragon had died 2 years ago or so. Sir Edward, Lord Physician to dragons, said it was from an incurable case of talon rot that got into the blood, a truly horrid way to go. But even if that were the case, Darcy was disinclined to consider that an adequate excuse for persistent oafish tendencies. On the other hand, Richard had on more than one occasion suggested that Darcy himself was not entirely good company on this journey either, even more so than his usual failings in social settings. Richard was probably being gracious. Considering the dangers of travelling, especially in such a large party with ladies and a child included, sociability was a low priority. Neither the 4 guard drakes, Brutus and Axel, who ran alongside the men's coach, and Alistair Salt's friends, who guarded the ladies, nor his faithful cockatrice friend Walker, who flew with Earl above their party, could calm his anxieties. Only being back at home would achieve that. Perhaps it was a little irrational, but Pemberley felt safe, far safer than being exposed on the road. And finally, it was in sight. "I imagine you will want the rest of the day to become reacquainted with your estate," St. John muttered, his voice scratchy and irritating, as he righted his posture and straightened his brown coat. When had he woken up? "It is customary. In fact, I think several days would be appropriate." Richard rolled his eyes a bit. That favourite Fitzwilliam expression he would likely never give up. "I have been away some months. I will need to meet with my steward, the head shepherd, and several of the major farmers." "The local vicar, the magistrate, and the head of the parish council as well, I imagine?" St. John all but sneered. "I find it telling where order business falls in your priorities." "Excuse me?" Darcy might finally succumb to his urge to pitch the man out of the carriage, something he had considered more than once over the last several days. "You do not understand the seriousness of the matters at hand?" Something about St. John's questions felt entirely insincere. Why had Darcy agreed to have a man who was a clear opponent to his wife and her office as a guest in his home? Now that same man was questioning his loyalty to the order? The irony. No other estate employs as many dragon friends, dragons, and heroes without friends, as Pemberley. I would say the business of Pemberley is the business of the order.
"I am sure you would."
"What precisely is that supposed to mean?" Darcy's voice dropped in pitch as he pulled his shoulders back and expanded his chest.
"That you have an egotistical, self-serving estimation of what order business entails."
St. John huffed and folded his arms over his chest.
Yes, I am aware that you have carried the Dragon Slayer, and that, in popular opinion, makes you quite the hero of the order. But such showy demonstrations are not what keep the order running. A true hero of the order—"
"A true hero? Have you any notion of what you are saying, man?" Richard brought his foot down heavily and leaned forward, just a hint of danger in his eyes.
I would not so freely insult one who has come face to face with not just one, but 2 angry fire drakes with blood in their eyes, and lived to tell the tale. Can you say you have done as much for the Order?" St. John had probably not even faced an angry Puck. His cheeks seemed to puff, and his face coloured. "That is exactly the trouble with men like you. You see the sword as the final, best answer to all the Order's problems, and it is not." "Then what would you suggest is the final, best answer?" Once offended, Richard would not be easily called off, so Darcy leaned back into the squabs to let them fight it out. "Have you never heard the pen is mightier than the sword?" Such a smug look St. John wore. "You are going to prove your point with a cliché? You must be mad. I have never had a man try to kill me with his pen." "You think not?" "I am rather certain with what implements my life has been threatened." Richard also bore the scars left by a number of those implements, but it would not be proper to mention that. "Have you ever considered the orders that sent you into those actions?" "What do you mean?" "The King's orders, the General's orders, all of the like. Those were formed by a pen." Richard snorted, his upper lip curled back. "You think that too literal? What about the Pendragon Treaty and Accords? Those came into being by an act of the pen, not the sword. They accomplished what the sword could not." Though Darcy loathed to admit it, St. John did have a point. St. John leaned in, eyes narrow. "And how do you think the provisions of those documents are managed? I will give you a hint. It is not by the sword even now. No, it is by the office of the Secretary of the Order. Through our enforcement of each and every provision in every county, every parish, every village, every estate. The state of the Dragon State rises and falls on the oversight of the Secretary and his division. Not even the Chancellor has so much influence on the day-to-day lives of those in the Order as we do." The tight little smile that stretched his thin lips was nothing short of self-important. "And after the recent showing of the Derbyshire dragons, it is quite clear that the affairs of this county have not been properly managed for quite some time." Darcy stepped on Richard's foot, an unsubtle suggestion that he not comment on this new round of veiled insults. "Yes, that is quite obvious and unfortunate, but I can assure you that Pemberley—" "Did you not just say that you have been away for quite some time, and are not even well acquainted with the affairs of your own estate?" St. John settled his hands over his paunch, so pleased with himself. "I said no such thing. I have left trusted men in charge of all aspects of the estate." Heat crept up from Darcy's neck to his ears. "Who have run it in your stead, leaving you unaware of the specific details of the estate?" "That does not imply that the estate has been ill-managed." "It does not imply that it has been well-managed." "I have faith." "That is well and good for you, but the Order does not run on faith. It runs on facts, and on adherence to the rule of law. If your estate is as well in hand as you suggest, then I am certain you will not object to me beginning my audit of the region with Pemberley." Oh, how he enjoyed his show of power. Despicable creature. Audit Pemberley. "Have you a problem with that?" "It is a waste of your time. Pemberley has never warranted Order interference, and it does not now." "Are you refusing the Secretary of the Order?" Richard leaned back, arms folded in a casual posture that he assumed when restraining himself from throttling an imbecile. "Auditing Pemberley is as absurd as auditing Matlock." "That is an interesting notion." St. John rubbed his chin with his knuckles, eyes taking on a dangerous glint. "When was the last time that Matlock was audited?" "Matlock, the seat of the Chancellor of the Order. You do realize what you are suggesting?"
Richard bolted upright, barely choking out the words. "I am well aware of the dragon and keeper assigned to that territory." "Count Matlock attends to those matters himself. He has always overseen all order matters on the estate." "As well he should, since he is the leading dragon of Derbyshire. His territory should be the exemplar of the region." "I am certain that it is. There is no need." "I will be the one to determine what is needed." St. John drummed his fingers against his knee. "Now that you have suggested it, I think auditing Matlock is a good idea. A very good one. In fact, since it is the Chancellor's territory, it deserves my first attentions. Then no other keeper can complain, with Matlock providing an example in all things." Richard's features crumpled into a mix of dread, frustration, and rage. "You will provide for me an introduction to your brother, the Viscount, yes? As I understand, he is junior keeper and running the estate while Chancellor and Count Matlock are in London." "I will do so, Mr. St. John. You will, though, do Matlock the courtesy of permitting me to call upon my brother first and inform him of your plans." Richard muttered through clenched teeth. "I assure you, it is in the best interest of the Order to do so." "I suppose a day or so of warning will not make a significant change in my findings. That will be acceptable." Chapter 3. So this was Pemberley, this huge, imposing stone monolith of a house, surrounded by a vast circular drive, which rose like an ancient henge, was Pemberley. Lydia hesitated as the footman tried to hand her out of the plush travelling coach. Neatly lined-up staff waited to greet the master and mistress of Pemberley, in front of a massive oak front door that stood open to welcome them inside. The ensemble felt only slightly less intimidating than the reception line of dragons she had faced at the cotillion. So many small dragons standing among the staff, all looking so excited, so pleased that the Darcys were come home. But she was not a Darcy. Breathe. She needed to remember to breathe. Swooning before she even set foot on Pemberley grounds would not set the right tone for her visit at all. She gripped the carriage door frame a little more tightly. Of all that Elizabeth had told her about the house, none of it prepared her for it to be so very, very grand. Mamma had a great deal to say about Mr. Darcy's— no, it was Sir Fitzwilliam now— about his wealth and consequence, but it all had felt like the flavour of exaggeration Mamma was prone to. But it was not at all. He really must be rich as an earl. Lydia sucked in another unsteady breath. If Mamma had any idea how grand a place Pemberley truly was, it would be difficult to persuade her by any means that she did not want to visit, or better yet, take up residence there. No wonder Lizzie had become so pensive at the thought. Mamma should definitely not be in a place with so many dragons, not even for an afternoon tea. Even when Mamma was under the draconic persuasion that the dragons were mundane creatures, she was short and impatient with them. No, Mamma was rude. That was the truth of it. They interfered with her notion of how things should be. That was enough to bring out a side of her that was not so genteel, and that was not a healthy attitude when surrounded by dragons. Lydia and Cosette would have to give the matter a good hard think, and see what they could come up with to help Lizzie manage Mamma. Cosette was clever with such things, and extremely persuasive when she needed to be. It was the least they could do, all things considered. With the footman's help, Lydia, Cosette on her shoulder, stepped down and hurried along the crunchy gravel path to Lizzie's side at the front of the servants' receiving line. April flitted toward them.
"Come, Cosette, I will introduce you to the household fairy dragons and the other dragons of the staff."
Cosette rested her front foot on Lydia's ear, her way of asking for Lydia's opinion.
"Yes, it is gracious of you to make introductions, April. Thank you."
Cosette zipped off behind April. Just how many fairy dragons were in line among the staff? 3 at least. And several little drakes, pucks, and was that a lesser cockatrix? Yes, it seemed so. And there must be worms in the gardens and woods, tatzelworms in the barns, not to mention the shepherding drakes in the fields, probably a few cockatrices who discreetly guarded the poultry. Heavens above, so many! Was Pemberley like this before Elizabeth became mistress, or was this a change she had wrought? Considering the number of older servants in line with their friends nearby, at least some of them must have been with the house since Mr. Darcy was a boy. How utterly unlike Longbourn, where Papa assiduously avoided having minor dragons in the house, except, of course, for April, whose presence he actively resented, and the late addition of Rumblekins, who he did not seem to appreciate either. Oh, this place was going to take some getting used to. Lydia. Elizabeth gestured toward a woman who could only be the housekeeper, with a brown spotted drake trotting beside her. "This is Mrs. Reynolds, Pemberley's housekeeper." The old woman curtsied, her expression entirely impossible to read. She was a small, compact woman, a little like Hill at Longbourn, who had been known to wear her authority like a military rank. Given the way the other servants looked at her, respect, not fear, ran her command. Wire-rimmed glasses perched on her thin nose, on an equally thin face. Grey hair, not a curl in sight, peeked from the edges of her plain, sturdy mob-cap. Clearly, this was not a woman to cross. Oh, what she must have heard about Lydia being sent to Mrs. Fielding's. What must she think of her? Lydia's face burned. Oh, what a bother it was to have an embarrassing episode in one's past, and forever wonder at what people knew and thought of one for it. Auntie said there was nothing to do for the past but acknowledge it happened and walk on. Probably good advice, but it might be far easier for a dragon to follow than a young lady.
"I have heard a great deal about your excellent service to Pemberley."
Lydia nodded at Mrs. Reynolds.
"Thank you, Miss Bennet."
She spoke Lydia's name gently. That must be a good thing, no?
"May I introduce Dale?"
A light brown drake, the size of a hunting dog, with large dark spots, rose up on its hind feet, as though to shake her hand, and bobbed his head. Unusual. Cream-coloured, pointy scales ran from his chin to his shoulders, giving the appearance of an odd, spiky beard. More such scales ran along the back of his head, rather like the ring of hair many bald men had around the back of their heads. What a funny little dragon he was.
"April said she would introduce my friend Cosette to the house dragons. I know she will be pleased to make your acquaintance, as am I."
Lydia curtsied to the dragon. Naturally, the proper sort of greeting to a minor drake had completely fallen out of her head. Dale matched her movements. That was supposed to be a sign of respect, was it not?
"I make it my business to run errands from one part of the house to another. Your maid will show you how to summon me should you be in need of my services."
"I had no idea the house was so very large."
"Dale's service is much appreciated." Lizzie scratched him under the chin, and the tip of his tail flicked, as is that of all our household dragons. Mrs. Reynolds signalled to a young maid, probably near Lydia's own age, slightly taller than either Lizzie or Lydia. Her round face and red cheeks matched her generally plump figure. "This is Betsy. I have assigned her as your maid for as long as you are with us, Miss Bennet."
"A maid? Of my own?"
Lydia gasped and turned to Lizzie. "That is the common practice, as I understand." The quirk of Lizzie's brow. She was teasing again.
"Are you comfortable with fairy dragons?"
Lydia beckoned toward April and Cosette, who were conversing with a green puck farther down the line. Betsy curtsied again and clicked her tongue 3 times. An iridescent green fairy dragon zipped over and landed on her shoulder.
"This is my friend Juniper. She is the smallest fairy dragon in the household. I have heard that Cosette is quite small too."
Yes, I am.
Cosette zoomed in to hover in front of Betsy and Juniper.
But that does not mean I am slow or stupid. Of course not,
Juniper said.
no more than I am. It is my job to help you become established here at Pemberley. I will show you where the best nectar flowers may be found, and the places to avoid because of rats and stoats. Oh, and all the best places to take a lovely bath.
No doubt she would also help Cosette find all the best places to listen for gossip as well.
"I am glad that Cosette will have a companion here at Pemberley."
Betsy, show Lydia to her rooms, then give her a tour of the house. Her trunks will be sent up as soon as they are unloaded. Lizzie turned to Lydia. Go get acquainted with your new home. Her new home. Lydia swallowed hard, whispering,
"I won't disappoint you."
"I know."
"This will be your room, Miss Bennet."
Betsy opened the door to a spacious chamber, light and airy, with the prettiest oak furniture and flowery paper hangings on the walls. The counterpane and bed and window curtains added soothing green tones that kept the room from feeling too busy. Though Lydia might have preferred more pink bits and a few pretty fluffy pillows, it was still the finest room she had ever stayed in. Cosette whirred in and flew 3 circuits around the room, racing Juniper on the last one.
"As I understand it, the Lady Sage chose this room particularly for the flying space it provided."
Betsy seemed to struggle against her smile. Servants were not supposed to have an opinion on such matters. Lydia pressed a hand to her mouth, but could not contain her giggles.
"How many households consider flying space when assigning quarters? Certainly none I have ever known. Pemberley is well known among order folk in Derbyshire for its welcome to small dragons and their friends. Do not think I am criticizing, for I am surely not. I know the Darcys are the best sort of dragon keepers and friends, to be sure. It just does take a little bit of getting used to when one did not grow up in such a home. I imagine it did for you, did it not? My father is the lead shepherd here, so I grew up with the shepherding drakes and all the barn tatzelworms. It all seems rather normal to me, miss."
Betsy shrugged, and her eyebrows rose in what seemed to be surprise. Oh, bother. Lydia had probably said something rather stupid.
"Then you are very fortunate, I think. I know Lizzie is always happiest around many dragons, so one must assume that is the province of dragons, to make those with them happy. I expect, then, I shall be incandescently happy here at Pemberley."
Yes, she was talking mostly nonsense, and Betsy's expression confirmed it. But these were the right things to say in order to make a good go of it. It was also rather exhausting.
"Show me the rest of the house. I can only imagine what it must be like." "Shall I give you the housekeeper's public tour first? Then I can show you the family rooms? Or do you prefer something else, miss?"
Pray lead on. With fairy dragons on their shoulders, Lydia followed Betsy out. Having a maid assigned to her was a lovely and thoughtful thing indeed, and more than she could have asked for. But it was also a bit strange, and would take some getting accustomed to. Betsy took her down the grand marble stairs, lined with graceful wrought iron railings, to the front hall. How odd that, other than the staff dragons, there were no dragons to be seen in the decor at all. Every Blue Order establishment Lydia had ever seen was covered in draconic images, from the front door to the back, and everywhere in between. Many of them quite ugly, but as long as there were dragons, it hardly seemed to matter.
"I can see what you are thinking, miss, and it is strange. Even our cottage has a carved dragon on the banister, and fairy dragons carved into the wood trim. I have heard it said that generations of Darcys have thought that the dragons in Pemberley should all be of the flesh and blood variety, so only a few decorative ones may be found in the house." Have you heard why the past generations of Darcys decided that? As I understand, and it is only from what I have heard, I am by no means certain, it is said that the Darcys thought that it was cheap lip service to decorate with dragons, if there were no hospitality shown to them otherwise, so they were determined to do different. That is a lovely sentiment, to be sure. It sounds so much like something my sister would say.
Perhaps that was why Lizzie had found such happiness with Darcy, Sir Fitzwilliam. So many similarities in the way they saw the world. Betsy stopped at the base of the grand stairs.
The front hall here is most impressive, the largest in the country, next to that of Matlock House, of course. The marble for the floor and staircase was imported from Italy, though a local blacksmith did all the ironwork in the house. Those paintings hung over the wall with the peonies. They are of the east and west views of the estate from the attics, where one can see for miles. This right here," she pointed to a hill on the east-facing painting, "is where Pemberley's lair is located, under that hill. It is well away from the sheep and the rest of the livestock. They get nervous with a dragon about, you know. So the fields nearby are not used for grazing. On the west you can see the fields for the flocks, the dairy barns, and the stable for the horses. Do they still look like that today? Later I can take you to the attics to see for yourself. But the barns are all bigger, as are the fields. Pemberley has flourished under Darcy management. The drawing rooms are just beyond."
Betsy walked off, clearly assuming that Lydia would follow. Betsy flung open the door.
"Wait here whilst I get the curtains."
She hurried to the large windows.
"This is called the Great Drawing Room, where guests wait for dinner to be served. The room next to it is the Lesser Drawing Room, which is used when there are fewer guests. But this wall here, it can be opened up for larger parties, and we call that making the Grand Drawing Room."
Betsy pulled back the curtains with a flourish, and light poured into the room. Great, grand, whatever it was called, it was easily the finest room Lydia had ever seen. With eggshell blue walls and white trims and mouldings, she scarcely wanted to enter it, much less touch anything within, covered as she was with travel dust. The ivory upholstery and gilded wood seating would surely be sullied by her person. Perhaps she was being a mite hard on herself, but with so many mirrors reflecting light and opulence, it was difficult to ignore the abundant reminders of her dishevelled state. From there, Betsy led her to the dining rooms, several of them. The great dining hall, whose long mahogany table could accommodate an astonishing number of guests. The family room, whose white linen-covered long table seated 12 comfortably. And the cosy little morning room. That room felt most like Lizzie, with warm, peachy walls reflecting light from the east-facing windows. The round table would seat 8 comfortably, with several smaller chinoiserie sideboards between the windows, conveniently near the table for food and drink. The master's study, the mistress's study, and the library followed in rapid succession, each one every bit as grand in its own way as the large public rooms. The long gallery, containing artworks collected over generations of the Darcy family, concluded the tour of the ground floor. Deep red walls and heavy, lush gold curtains accented the paintings, and marble statuary lined the walls of the room that ran at least half the length of the back side of the house. The ground floor of Pemberley alone was bigger than all of Longbourn put together, even including attics and cellars.
"As I understand, this space,"
Betsy pointed to an open place on the wall,
"is to be filled by a portrait of Sir Fitzwilliam and the Lady Sage."
How strange it was to consider Lizzie being part of the company in this room.
"Now, upstairs."
Betsy described the paintings that lined the grand stairs. Darcy ancestors tracing back, she said, to the first Darcy to inhabit these walls. Supposedly there were paintings in the attic that dated back to before the Darcys took residence. It would be interesting to see those some day. The second floor boasted an ivory-walled room
with a huge bay window surrounding a dainty ivory and gold pianoforte, a harp, and an entire matching cabinet for sheet music. Perhaps a dozen wooden chairs, painted gold with plum cushions, made an arc in 2 rows around the piano.
"Such a shame that Miss Darcy is not here to enjoy it. The room has long been her favourite," Betsy said. "She was an excellent musician, but I am sure you have heard her play and sing, and know that quite well. Such a sweet girl. Did you have the opportunity to know her well?"
Clearly, Betsy, and perhaps the rest of the household, were ignorant of Miss Darcy's true nature. Perhaps they did not know she had been sent off to the same school Lydia had attended. No doubt they would find out soon enough, but not from Lydia. Cosette had probably already told Juniper by now. Fairy dragon gossip circulated very, very quickly. How would the staff react to that news, though? Would they somehow hold that against Lydia? Perhaps it was a trifle far-fetched, but people's feelings rarely made real sense if one looked at them too closely. Betsy revealed 3 upstairs parlours, one favoured by the Lady Sage and probably best left for her use alone, unless by invitation, one for the use of the family, and one for the comfort of house guests. Lydia, of course, would have the use of the family parlour. Something in the way Betsy explained that. There was something unspoken there, but it was difficult to tell just what. The guest bedrooms, or at least what she saw of them, as there were too many to visit them all, with their adjoining dressing rooms and sitting rooms, were grander than her own. A tiny pang of jealousy tried to spark its way to life. But those rooms were in the guest wing. Her room was in the family wing, and that was grander than any guest room could ever be. Chapter 4. June 9th, 1815, Matlock Estate. Richard dismounted and handed his, or rather Darcy's, horse off to the waiting groom, and sauntered toward Matlock's front door. The Palladian-style manor, with its towering columns and austere classical exterior, frowned down upon him, as it always had. Some things would never change. That was comforting in an odd, uncomfortable way. Aching back, hips, knees, and the makings of a capital headache, not to mention a rapidly advancing afternoon sun, demanded that this be a brief visit. All told, he would have preferred to have cleaned up and settled into one of Pemberley's guest rooms, rather than jump on a horse and head out to Matlock. But the alternatives were far, far worse. Father hardly welcomed surprises, and Andrew detested was hardly a strong enough word to describe his reactions. Bad enough that Matlock was to be audited first. No Fitzwilliam alive would consider that anything but the gravest of insults. Allowing that to come unexpected to Andrew's doorstep? Unthinkable. The tall, imposing butler, stone-faced as ever, showed him to the family parlour, where Andrew would deign to receive his company. Ivory and gold-striped paper hangings somehow gave the room greater formality, not less. So did the just barely casual furnishings, with impractically pale upholstery. Heaven forfend one actually relax and feel comfortable in any public room of the manor, or any private one for that matter. You could have bothered to clean up before appearing for dinner. That is still considered decent, you know. Andrew stood from his uncomfortable chair, where he pretended to read a book, tugging his jacket straight. He sniffed through his thin, sharp nose, his pale blue eyes vaguely watery. "I thought you were staying at Pemberley. Your room has not been made up." "I am staying at Pemberley." Richard would sooner stay at the inn in Lambton than at Matlock. Even the barn might be preferable. "I am here as a courtesy to you." "Courtesy? To me? Really? How might that be? It has never been your way before." Andrew flicked imaginary dust from his sleeve with long fingers that had never seen a day of work. No, he was not resentful of his elder brother. Not at all.
I have news that you might consider important to act upon before it is too late.
Too late? That does make it all sound rather urgent, does it not? Well then, tell me of it. Or do I need to beg you? Or is it a bribe you are looking for? Overspent your allowance, perhaps?
I am not dependent upon Matlock for my upkeep. Have you forgotten I have an estate and keep of my own?
Damn, he had fallen for Andrew's bait again.
Oh, yes, you have that foreign worm to manage, that is right, and the quaint little plot of nowhere they gave you to keep him on. Is the estate supporting you in the manner to which you are accustomed?
Why did Andrew so resent the fact that Richard had become a gentleman? The elevation in status should have improved Andrew's opinion, not lowered it. Netherford and I are quite satisfied, thank you. A messenger brought word that Count Matlock would be back in his lair soon. Something about returning Pemberley to her estate. Is that right? As I understand it. I do not understand the interest he takes in that annoying little dragon of Darcy's. I do hope he does not plan to stay long. He is such a cross old lizard, complaining about everything whilst he is here. With Andrew's attitude, it was no wonder Matlock should be cross. I do not know of his plans, but I expect what I have to tell you will not make him any less cranky. What is it, man? Do stop holding this news of yours over my head. Out with it. The Under-Secretary of the Order, the Honourable Swinton St. John, is at Pemberley now, and means to take a very close look at the Derbyshire dragons. Are you suggesting I should invite him to tea? I will let Martha know directly. She is the one to manage social engagements. I expect he will be disagreeable company, though. Everyone in the Secretary's department seems to be rather boorish, what with all the rules and regulations they insist upon. I am sure he has no desire to have tea with your wife. No one did, actually, but that was another matter entirely. He will be coming to call upon you. Me? Why, surely it is father he wants to talk to. No, it is you. For heaven's sake, whatever for? Colour rose along Andrew's pale jaw. It probably was in no one's best interest to continue to plague him, though it jolly well felt deserved. Not only are you junior keeper here, but you have been managing the keep whilst father has been in London. What of it? St. John has gotten it in his craw that the entire county has been mismanaged, hence the entire debacle prior to the cotillion. What debacle? I have not had nearly enough brandy to discuss that, nor do I intend to stay long enough for that to happen. It will have to wait until another day, or you can write to father for the pertinent details. But the point is, the man is determined to get to the root of the problems in Derbyshire, and he means to start here. Start here? I do not understand. Andrew's eyes widened as bravado slowly drained from his face. He only ever wore a mask of courage, never had the substance. He means to audit the estate, every jot and tittle, to evaluate the nature of the keeping here. He cannot do that. This is the Chancellor's estate. He has no place, no right to intrude. I am afraid, dear brother, in that you are entirely and completely wrong. In matters of the keep, the department of the Secretary outranks even the Chancellor. I will not have it. Andrew pounded his fist into his palm. He cannot insert himself into my home. Yes, he can. That is what I have come to warn you about. He will probably be here at dawn tomorrow, the next day if you are extremely lucky, with plans to audit the entire estate. Every clause of the Charter will be examined, and evidence of compliance scrutinized. By the way, when was the last census of the dragons of Matlock territory? Census? A census of dragons? I have no idea what you are talking of. That is the job of the steward, is it not? That was what I was afraid of. You can find all the details of what will be required in 2 volumes kept alongside of the estate charter in father's office.
If I recall correctly, they have always been kept on the shelves behind his desk. Good day." Richard turned sharply and headed for the door. "Wait, you cannot go. Clearly you understand what all this means. I insist you help." "No. As you made abundantly clear, I have my own estate to manage. Matlock is yours, all the privileges and all the responsibilities. I wish you well in it." He slipped through the door and shut it firmly behind him. Chapter 5. June 12th, 1815. Elizabeth rocked gently in the old white rocker, holding Anne close, drinking in that soft, sweet scent of baby, the one she had feared she might never experience again, whilst locked in the dank, hopeless hold of the sea lion, the one she would never take for granted again. Shutting her eyes, it was easy to pretend, for just a moment, that the rest of the world did not exist. Perhaps they could ride away on the old whitewashed rocking horse that stood in the corner, a toy Darcy remembered quite fondly, or maybe build a tower of blocks, a castle retreat into their own private little world. When Anne was first born, the attics seemed so far away, too far away for a nursery. Nanny and Anne had been established in a nearby room in the family wing. Only after Anne's constant sleeplessness emerged did Darcy insist on reopening the attic nursery suite. While Anne's sleep problems did not completely resolve until Nanny's dismissal, the quiet, soothing environs of the long white room with windows that framed the picturesque Pemberley landscape improved her rest significantly. Too much white in a room could feel cold and sterile, forgotten and ignored. But here, in the room where Darcy had spent his infancy, with its fresh, clean smell, simple white-painted furniture, and plain polished floor, white was calming, peaceful, an escape from the complicated, serious aspects of life that took place downstairs, a place Elizabeth relished escaping to as often as she could. Anne wriggled and squirmed, so Elizabeth set her down on the faded rug, another one made by the late Lady Anne, for whom little Anne was named. Scraps of family clothing and household textiles braided into the rug told stories of the previous generation of Darcys. Perhaps one day Elizabeth would add her own rag rug to this room. "Is there anything else you will need to fit up the nursery?" Elizabeth asked the quiet, patient figure, who sat reading in the far corner near the windows. "No, madam. Everything seems to be well in hand. My compliments to Mrs. Reynolds. There aren't many who can clean a nursery to suit me. She and I will get on famously, just as you said. Truth and Mercy are utterly smitten with Mrs. Reynolds' friend Dale. He took it upon himself to show them around, and found just the right basket that would fit them and May altogether." Mrs. Sharp gestured toward the knot of Zaltis and Tatzelworm in a large willow basket by the painted fire screen that blocked the currently unused fireplace. The fine lines of Mrs. Sharp's face were relaxed, and her green eyes bright, radiating peace and contentment. Such a complete contrast from the nervous energy that had followed Drake Nanny. With her white mob cap and apron over her dark dress, Mrs. Sharp seemed to fit into the nursery as though it had been planned just for her. Yes, this was exactly the change the household needed. "I am not surprised at Dale's solicitousness toward their comfort. He has taken it upon himself to be lead dragon in the household. He wears his dominance among the staff well. The dragon's house steward, as it were. An apt description. Are you sure there is nothing else you need?" Elizabeth stood and stretched her shoulders forward. The tight, cramped feeling from the long journey had not yet faded. "Are you certain you wish to have such elegant furnishings in my quarters? I hardly expected pieces that should belong in the family rooms." Mrs. Sharp glanced toward the door at the far, narrow end of the room that led to her chambers. No, I am quite certain. It may not be the prevailing opinion,
but it seems only appropriate to see to the comfort of the one who sees to my daughters, especially when your job has so many extra, unusual demands attached. I can hardly imagine accommodating the visits of the staff dragons will be taxing." Mrs. Sharp's eyes crinkled as she smiled. "We have not met a single one who is not amiable, nor failed to make Mercy and Truth feel quite welcome. We have already worked out a system which, as I understand, Dale is explaining throughout the house, that when I have a ribbon hung from the doorknob, little Anne is not to be disturbed." "That is very clever." Nanny was never welcoming toward the rest of the staff dragons. "I have been concerned that they might make up for lost time a bit too energetically. I am sure May, Mercy, and Truth will all assist us in finding the right balance. It is such a remarkable thing, raising an infant with dragon companionship, Lady Sage. I am honored to be a part of the exercise." Everything in Mrs. Sharp's countenance suggested she spoke the truth. With a delightful baby chortle, Anne crawled toward the basket, where the 3 nursery dragons entwined. All 3 poked up their heads and looked at her. May purred loudly as Anne sat beside the basket and energetically patted the knot of dragons. "Gentle, Anne. You must be gentle with your friends." Elizabeth crouched beside her daughter. "Remember, it is a privilege to be friends. You must always be kind. Mercy and Truth, I have told May already, but you must feel free to let her know if she has been too rough with you."
"Yes, Lady Sage."
Mercy, whose head crest had wide yellow stripes and red spots, rose up tall and reached for Elizabeth, who stroked under her chin. Such soft, supple skin she had, and such elegant eyelashes.
"No other human hatchling we have known has seemed to hear us so well as Miss Anne,"
Truth said in her sweet, hissy, lispy, distinctly snake-type voice. "I am pleased to know that." Elizabeth gave each dragon a scratch, and her daughter a gentle hug, then stood. "I anticipate Mr. Darcy will be visiting the nursery quite regularly." Mrs. Sharp raised an eyebrow. Yes, it was odd for fathers to take an interest in babies, especially daughters. "Very good, madam. Will he find the rocking chair comfortable, or should another chair better suited for him be found?" "An excellent thought. I am not certain, but I will consult with him on the matter, and make the necessary arrangements. And I will let him know about the ribbons myself. After so many months of sleeplessness, he will not want to awaken Anne accidentally. I shall return later this afternoon." Anne pulled up on Elizabeth's skirts. She picked Anne up, cuddled her a moment more, and put her into Mrs. Sharp's waiting arms. "Miss Anne usually naps until 3 o'clock, unless you wish me to try to alter her schedule." "Oh, heavens, no. It is quite a joy to know she has one at all. I will adjust myself accordingly." Mrs. Sharp curtsied, and Elizabeth left the nursery. The plain hallway seemed cold, dark, and empty as she shut the door behind her. If only she could spend the rest of the day in the nursery, after all the time lost to her encounter with the movers, and the recent crises of the cotillion and Bolsover. Her time with Anne had suffered. That would change now they were home, though. Still, she did not have to try to make up for all the loss in a single day. Or so she would tell herself as often as necessary, until she believed it. The narrow attic stairs ended in a landing that connected the family wing, the guest wing, and the grand stairs. A maid and her puck friend, a feather duster carried in her jaws, bustled past. Her respite from the world was definitely over. She would meet with Mrs. Reynolds after breakfast, as usual. Until then, her office called. The final rays of sunshine poured through open curtains, lending a peach glow to everything they touched. Nearly everything seemed quite as she had left it before their sojourn in London. A pitcher of fennel water, with a matching crystal tumbler, waited on her desk. Mrs. Reynolds must have been there before her.
While sharing a working space with Darcy in London had its own charms, there was something soothing about being back in her own territory. Gracious, how draconic that sounded. The wood-panelled room had once served as a steward's office, convenient to Darcy's study, with the library sandwiched between the two. But at Darcy's insistence, another space was made available to the steward. Ample bookcases, though a bit mismatched, had been procured from other rooms, now awaiting the books she had brought back from London. Wooden book crates were stacked before them. Her nose itched. Someone had forgotten to dust the books before packing them. She sneezed. That would need attention soon. So many things needed her attention. A graceful writing desk and matching chair, all loops and swirls and feminine grace, stood near the windows, impractical as they were attractive. A squat, practical pair of comfortable chairs, with a matching footstool, had come from a dressing-room in the guest wing. It was a shame to pilfer from their guests, but far better for the furniture to have regular use than to stand collecting dust. Mrs. Reynolds insisted they would not be missed, and Elizabeth dare not argue with her. An iron dragon perch that matched the heirloom one in Darcy's office stood between desk and windows. April needed only a small basket lined with soft to feel comfortable in the room. But with Walker's typical cockatrice dislike of perching on chairs, it was important to ensure he was as comfortable and welcome here as he was in Darcy's office. She sank into the chair behind her desk. It was good to be home. Opening the blue leather diary that sat atop a neat stack of journals on her desk, she found Mrs. Reynolds' list of staff dragon interviews for the day. No better way to become alert to any issues in the house than to hear it straight from the dragon's mouth. Next week she would have to... No, next week was just that, next week. Focus on today, lest the overwhelming number of tasks to be accomplished distract her from even managing even one. Breathe. Just breathe. She turned to a fresh page and retrieved her pencil from the desk drawer. Time for a list. Little settled the overtaxed soul like a paper list to order one's thoughts and quell the fear of forgetting something. Except when the list grew to 2 pages and was far from finished. She leaned back in her chair and squeezed her temples. Her new secretary, a Drake recommended by Papa's secretary Drew, should be arriving in a few days. Darcy insisted that she needed the help, but truly, what was a secretary going to do for her? It was not like Papa, who needed help fetching materials from the library and writing things down. He could barely walk or hold a pen these days. She was perfectly capable of both. How would she possibly find enough for a secretary to do? One more thing to add to her list. Talons scratched at the door. "Come in." And so it would begin. Dale padded in on 4 feet, tail held slightly above the carpet so his scales would not catch. Among all the minor drakes she had known, he was unique for many reasons. With his unusual beard and dark spots on lighter hide, he was one of those drakes one could identify at a distance. Like his friend Mrs. Reynolds, he considered the pride of Pemberley Manor as dear to him as his own. Perhaps a mite too serious about it at times, but even that was difficult to consider a true shortcoming in his character. Even if his sense of humor might be lacking, he was dependable and loyal and forthright, sometimes to a fault, making him the perfect dragon with whom to begin conversations. He stood before her desk, extending his front feet and touched chin to the ground. "Good morning, Lady Sage." She stood and tapped the back of his prickly head gently with 2 fingers. "Good morning, Dale. I look forward to what you have to tell me. Pray, take a seat." She pulled the worn wooden footstool near the desk. He hopped up and sat down, a little like a dog might have. A touch informal, but the arrangement put him closer to eye level with her, which was always far more comfortable for her, and did not require him to fit himself into a chair that cramped his glorious tale. Dominance had been established and recognized, so there was little need to reinforce it by towering over him.
With what shall I begin, Lady Sage?
I should like to know about the household, particularly regarding the dragons. There were several new servants and friends added to the house shortly before we left for London. I did not see the hall boy and his little worm friend in the reception line. Perhaps begin with him?
Ah, yes, Oliver and Pete.
Dale rasped his spiky chin against his forepaw.
There is a story to be told there. Oliver was a good enough lad, all told, rather like most small boys, but he was trying hard enough that Mrs. Reynolds was willing to endure the vexations of having so young a person in her service. But the worm was another matter.
In what way?
In the way worms are apt to be, Lady Sage.
I do not approve of judging a dragon by its type, and I will not tolerate that in the household management. I thought I made that clear.
She almost swallowed back her snort, but that was the manner of posturing dragons best understood, so she indulged.
Forgive me, you have. I only meant that this worm in particular proved unsuitable to the household in all the ways that one usually expects of a worm.
Hardly better, but at least he was trying.
And what ways would those be?
For one thing, he developed a disagreeable habit of burrowing under the carpets, pulling up the tacks and rumpling them. Molly, the scullery maid, nearly broke her ankle tripping in a room that the worm had plundered. She is well recovered now, though.
I am pleased to hear that, but plundered, that is a very strong word.
What else does one call it when the liquor cabinet is overturned, and the worm is found inebriated, asleep in the middle of a puddle of brandy? And before you ask, yes, the rules of the house were made clear to him, and there was a proper beer ration offered. He was neither hungry nor thirsty, simply mischievous.
Dale bared